Before we get going, I want to speak a little bit about the Bucks County Young Democrats. We're an organization of young people across Bucks County dedicated to seeing Democrats elected up and down the ballot. From Inspector of Elections to President of the United States, and of course Congress, our members are out helping candidates run or running as candidates themselves. If you know a Democrat who is registered in Bucks County between the ages of 18 and 40, we want to talk to them. Yes, we're all the way up to 40. We're not as young as you might think. Please have them email us at bucks@payoungdems.org or attend one of our monthly meetings if they're interested. Our next meeting will take place on March 25th at 6 p.m. at the Newtown Township Building, pending any possible COVID restrictions by that time. Hopefully none. Before we start getting into the structure of today's debate, I'd like to take a moment to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. We have a flag behind us, so we'll go ahead and kick that off. I pledge allegiance to
the flag
of
the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Always a fun time doing that over Zoom with everybody at different rates. All right. For the debate, I'm going to go over our format. The candidates have already seen the general structure. I'm going to explain a shortened version for our viewers. This debate will be broken into 3 parts. We'll start with the opening statements from each candidate, followed by an hour of questions and wrapping up with closing statements. Candidates will each have 2 minutes for their opening statement and 2 minutes for their closing statement. During the question segment, each candidate will be given 90 seconds to respond to the question. Our moderators will give the candidates a signal when they have 30 seconds left. Should the question warrant further discussion, the moderators may choose to ask additional follow-up questions to the candidates. Today's questions are a combination of issues our membership is concerned about and questions submitted ahead of time from the general public via web forum. My thanks to all of you who submitted your questions. In the interest of covering as much ground as possible, we will be addressing several different topics this morning. A coin flip will determine speaking order. The winner can choose whether or not to deliver their opening statement first. The candidate who opens first will deliver their closing statement first, and the candidate who opens last will deliver their closing statement last. Debate and constructive conversation is of course encouraged today, but we ask each candidate to please refrain from personal attacks. With that said, we are ready to move on to the coin flip. And since Ashley Ehasz was the first one to join the meeting, I'm going to let Ashley call it. We're just using a quarter. You can all see that there. And since both of our candidates are veterans, I was able to find a quarter that commemorates the war in the Pacific. So
awesome. Well done, Dan.
Yeah, that was pure luck. So, all right. Ashley, call it in the air.
Heads.
And it is tails. Paul, do you want to deliver your opening statement first or second?
I'll go second.
Okay. Ashley, take us away.
Yes, and thank you all so much for having me here today. I'm so grateful to have this time with you all. My name is Ashley Ehasz, and I am running for Congress right here in our community. I grew up right here in southeastern Pennsylvania to a single mom household. And she herself, my mom, was born to a single mother. So we dealt with a lot of the issues that families right here in our community are dealing with. And when I was 17, I joined the military as a way to create opportunities I otherwise would not have had. I was really fortunate to go to West Point, but I only got there because of my community. My next door neighbor was a high school teacher who made an investment in me and helped me with my application. So that sense of community support is incredibly important to me and is a value system I will bring forward into the seat. And when I was in the service, I was an attack helicopter pilot, but much more importantly, I was a commander. I commanded several hundred soldiers overseas and here at home. And so I dealt with the type of crises that we are seeing right here in our community. And make no mistake, we are finding ourselves in a moment of crisis. Too many families here in our community are buried under lack of opportunities, living paycheck to paycheck, unable to afford the basic necessities. And it is no coincidence that in the year following January 6th, we are seeing our voting rights, our reproductive freedoms, our economic rights being stripped away from us. And that's because families here are so buried under economic debt that it's tough to get out there and fight for those rights. And that's exactly how the Republicans and Brian Fitzpatrick want it. They want us buried under lack of opportunities while they go to Washington and undo our democracy and line their pockets. And we deserve a leader here in our community who will vote courageously and who will vote in a way that our community deserves. And I'm so grateful to join you all today to show you why I am that leader who can beat Brian Fitzpatrick and will vote courageously and with dignity for the members of our community. Thank you so much for having me here today. Looking forward to the discussion.
You know, I was going to do that at least once, talking while I was muted. Thank you very much, Ashley. And now, Paul, please deliver your opening statements.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Bucks County Dems, and thanks everybody who's joining on a Saturday morning, time away from family. My name is Paul Fermo. I'm running for Congress against Brian Fitzpatrick. I come from a working class family, a family that taught me the values of serving my country, and I proudly served my country as a Navy fighter pilot, flying off aircraft carriers, fighting in both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was fortunate to be selected during my time on active duty to go to Capitol Hill as one of only 19 naval officers selected to be a Defense Legislative Fellow, where I served for a member on the House Armed Services Committee. I was very fortunate to be selected to go to the staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon, where I advised senior members of our military structure. And I was fortunate to be selected to go to our premier senior war college, the National Defense University, where I graduated with distinction in a degree, with a master's degree in national security studies. When I decided to get out, I got my MBA from MIT, and I now lead a small technology company in the aerospace industry. My wife, Debbie, is a Doylestown native. She grew up here. We met in the Navy in flight school, and so she's also a veteran. And in 2016, we decided we want to come home to raise our kids right back here in Bucks County so that our children could be by their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, their cousins, all of whom who live right here in PA1. I was compelled to get in this race for a lot of reasons, January 6th being one of them, but that wasn't the only reason. I wanted to get in this race because I saw our leaders letting us down. I got tired of seeing our leaders put political aspirations in front of our country and before their integrity. I got tired of seeing our political leaders put their party in front of the kinds of legislations that we need as families in Bucks County. I know this because I am raising a family, unlike Brian Fitzpatrick, and I know how hard it is to make ends meet right now. And I know it because I'm someone who has a son and a wife with a disease that I have to care for every day. I have to navigate a very difficult and expensive healthcare system. And Brian Fitzpatrick obviously doesn't know about that because he voted against it. And I know what it means to run a small business and how challenging it is to operate an economy that we have today and the things that we need to plan for in the future that Brian Fitzpatrick isn't planning for. My direct experience helps me to understand the issues that are most important to Americans right now and makes me the best candidate to beat Brian Fitzpatrick. And I want to take that experience with me to Washington to fight for the people of Bucks County, and I hope you'll join me.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you both for keeping your statements very close to 2 minutes. Much appreciated. All right. That said, we will get started with the main questions of the debate. I will start with some of the opening questions, and John will jump in on some of the others. Since Ashley opened first, she will answer the first question. She will answer the question first, and we'll do our best to alternate who's answering each question first going forward. All right. So our first topic of conversation is Brian Fitzpatrick. Since 2005, a Fitzpatrick has represented Bucks County in Congress for 13 of those 17 years, with Brian serving the last 5. Several questions were submitted online asking why 2022 will be different from previous elections. Ashley, what is your strategy to end this losing streak?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. So we must start by asking ourselves the question, with Brian Fitzpatrick in the seat, are families any better off here in our community? And the answer is no. This is someone who has proven he is against families. He voted against universal pre-K, insulin capped at $35 a month, paid family leave while families are trying to get established here. he has shown again that he is against families. And also, he has shown that he is not willing to talk with his constituents. He does not hold open town halls in person, which I'm proud to say I will do. And my team will be putting it out here shortly, but we signed the town hall pledge just yesterday because that open dialogue is incredibly important. And it's important to remember that our voting rights, our reproductive rights are on the line this year. And Brian Fitzpatrick has made it clear he is not going to stand up for those things. So this is the year that he has his last year in office. He is particularly vulnerable. This is a district that will be a key district. And, oh, I'm so sorry, were you giving me time?
Sorry, 30 seconds, yes.
Thank you so much. This will be a key district this year. And if we look back, President Biden won by 9 percentage points. Brian Fitzpatrick, in the wake of January 6th and his incredibly bad votes on the economy and the way that it affects families here, has proven he is at his most vulnerable this cycle. We will absolutely take advantage of that and flip this seat red to blue.
Thank you, Ashley. Paul, same question. This year, what is your strategy to end the losing streak to Brian Fitzpatrick?
Well, for starters, I think we need to show people where he's let us down. He's passed on abortion rights. He's passed on healthcare issues that would be important to families. He's passed on legislation that would help small businesses. He didn't stand up for January 6th as the former head of the political corruption task force in the FBI. He sat on his hands and watched as President Trump, or didn't vote for the commission to investigate President Trump. And if I don't know what, if that's not political corruption, I don't know what is. So I think we need to call Brian Fitzpatrick out for what he's done and what he's failed to do. But I also think as a voter, you know, as I look at races, I want to know candidates that connect with me and the issues that are most important to me. I'm very proud of my national security experience. Brian Fitzpatrick likes to talk about his as well. But I know that there's a lot of voters in our district who don't care that much about those issues. And so what else is there? Unlike Brian Fitzpatrick, I understand what it's like raising a family. And there are so many people in our districts who are raising families now and who are struggling with families, who are struggling with healthcare, and who are struggling with the economy. I think we have to show where Brian Fitzpatrick hasn't met the mark on those issues, where he should have, where he's not planning, where he's not leading, and then use that
30 seconds, Paul.
I'm sorry?
30 seconds.
Oh, thank you. And taking that experience forward so that voters know that I've walked in their shoes, I know what it's like to be in those issues, and that's why I would be a better representative for them.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Since I tripped both of you up equally, I am just going to hold this sign up going forward to let you know you have 30 seconds because I don't want to interrupt your train of thought. All right, on to our next question. Even in presidential years with record turnout numbers, the Democratic candidate facing Brian Fitzpatrick has struggled to sway voters. With 2022 being a midterm election year and midterms traditionally having lower voter turnout, especially on the Democratic side, what can you do to convince enough voters to show up for you on election day? Paul, you have the answer first.
Well, that's what I'll say again. I think here experience matters, and we've talked a lot about the issues in Washington, policy debates, but you know, lots of people can talk about policy. Families, people know that what's written down on paper, what's written in policy, oftentimes is very different than what happens in real life. When I was in Afghanistan, I had to go out into the community to meet with warlords, village elders, and a lot of them had different interests. But what I needed to do was find some common ground, help them to understand what we were all fighting for together so that we can move forward together collectively. I think the same philosophy is true in elections. People want to know that candidates understand where they are, understand the challenges that they go through, have walked a little bit in their shoes. And so when they go forward to solve those problems, they have that nuanced perspective, are able to see those challenges through the lens of real life so that they know what kind of policies are necessary to solve those problems. I have that experience. I'm prepared to do that. And I think that's why I'm the right person to win. Go ahead. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Paul. And Ashley, same question to you. Do you need me to repeat the question or are you good?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Dan.
Yep.
And at first, actually, I want to start by pushing back on the assumption that this is going to be just an uphill climb, because that's what Brian Fitzpatrick and the Republicans want us to think. That said, I think voters who are looking for something new want to see that next generation leadership, and they want to see a candidate that has very real skin in the game, which is exactly what I bring to the table. As a young woman, as a combat veteran, as someone who grew up in a working class family right here in southeastern Pennsylvania, I know what it's like to live in really tough conditions and have to create opportunities for yourself that otherwise would not be there. And I think that is what will motivate voters in this election cycle. They want to see someone out there who will run an offensive campaign against Brian Fitzpatrick, which is exactly what we've already been doing. Just the other night when I spoke at the Newtown Supervisors meeting, tying Brian Fitzpatrick publicly to Jim Worthington and calling him out for his bad actions, bad votes, and bad friends. And that is exactly what I think voters will respond to and be motivated to come out and finally get him out of this seat. Thanks, Dan.
Sorry, lost my mouse there. All right, thank you both. We have one more question on Brian Fitzpatrick. So, Pennsylvania's 1st District is an expensive place to run. It's no secret that Brian Fitzpatrick alone has spent millions on this race in the past and is poised to do so again. That doesn't even account for outside Republican groups that will dump millions of dollars into this race to prevent a Democrat from winning. Can you raise enough money to compete in this race? Ashley, we'll start with you.
Yes, thank you so much. And the short answer is yes, I absolutely can. This will be a key district this cycle. So all eyes nationally will be on it. But also we need to recognize that there is a lot of dark money in politics, and Brian Fitzpatrick takes part in that. So we look at the numbers that he raises, but we need to keep in mind that it comes from bad actors and those who just want to control this seat. And there are a lot of good people, good voters who are invested in actually flipping this seat. And I will love to say that we are running a really great grassroots campaign. In my first quarter of all the funding that we did raise, 70% of what we raised came from right here in the Commonwealth. And of that, nearly 70% came from right here in the district, in the district, which tells me voters are seeing the type of leadership they are seeing in me, in my campaign, and they're showing that they are willing to get out there and fund it and get out there and knock doors for it. And I'm incredibly proud to say that. So yes, we can beat Brian Fitzpatrick, and we will raise the money to do so.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Paul, same question to you. How will you raise enough money to compete against Brian?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, it will take a lot of money, but we're already doing that. We've done really well in our first quarter. There are so many people, even across the country, who recognize that PA1 is one of the key swing districts across the nation. We've received investment not only here from PA1, but also all the way across the nation, California, Florida, and otherwise. I think it's going to take that kind of campaign to raise the kind of money we need to beat them. And I think it's going to take some coalitions, and having connections to coalitions like that will be very important. Many of you know Amy McGrath, who ran against Mitch McConnell. Amy's a close personal friend of mine. We've already spoken, and she's already committed to supporting. Many of you know Seth Moulton in Massachusetts. Seth and I fought together in the Battle of al-Najaf in Iraq, and I've talked to him closely about his pact. Also, Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey. We went to flight school together in the Navy. So having those kinds of close connections and coalitions will matter to get a grassroots campaign that goes not just through Pennsylvania, but beyond.
Okay, thank you both. Didn't even need to use a sign on that. All right, moving on, our next subject will be electoral reform. I'm going to hand these questions off to my cohort, John Panofsky.
Good afternoon. For everybody who came in late, my name is John. I am the vice chair of the Bucks County Young Democrats, among other things. So we're going to be talking about electoral reform. And Paul, I believe the question is to you. So the question first is, do you believe the 2020 election was a free and fair election and that Joe Biden was the winner?
I do. That's a short answer. The answer is yes, of course. Joe Biden won by 7 million votes. So I think, of course, it was a clear and fair election.
Okay, Ashley?
Yes, also believe that Joe Biden won the presidency. It was a free and fair election, and we had leaders on both sides of the aisle step up and fight back against the nefarious attempts at undoing the election. So yes, Joe Biden, president, free and fair election.
Awesome. Ashley, do you believe that our election laws are adequate to safeguard future elections? If not, what parts of the law would you change?
Yes. So I believe as they stand, our laws made sure our 2020 election was free and fair. However, we need to look at the ways that Republicans are attempting to undo a lot of those laws. Attacks on our voting rights right now are being made left and right, especially here in the Commonwealth. And as a veteran, as someone who signed up to defend the Constitution of the United States, I signed up to defend our voting rights. And it is incredibly important to have leaders elected this cycle who can help fight back against those trying to undo voting rights for all of our citizens. Because if we lose in 22, that makes 2024 that much harder if the wrong people get elected into this seat. So yes, we need to protect voting rights. As we saw on January 6th, there are bad actors who are looking to undo fundamental rights of citizens in this country, in this Commonwealth.
Okay, and Paul, do you need the question again?
Yeah, sure.
So do you believe our election laws are adequate to safeguard future elections? If not, what parts would you change?
I do agree they're adequate right now, but I agree also that voting rights are under attack. Jonathan, I remember when I served overseas, we all remember people lining up in Afghanistan and Iraq with their purple fingers saying that they voted. I flew close air support over those lines to protect them, to make sure that they could vote. So it's remarkable to me when we come back home to our country to see our own citizens, the Republicans, trying to undo the voting rights that we have. So I think we need to be hard on that. I think we need to call that out where we see it, so we can continue to protect the rights that all people should have, Republican, Democrat, and independent, to vote.
Okay. Paul, do you support statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico? Why or why not?
I support, at this point, I don't think that I would support that, but I support continuing that discussion for both Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico.
Ashley?
Yes, great question. So I also support the continued dialogue around DC's entry into statehood. I also see the really great importance of making sure all voters are accounted for, but I also think we need to look at the greater question and make sure we account for all angles on that question, but open to the continued dialogue.
Okay. I am going to turn it back over to our Bucks County Young Dems Chair, Dan Wood, for a few further questions.
Great. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. All right, moving on. Our next section will be on education. I will be asking the first question, and John will be asking a follow-up question on that. As young Democrats, a constant concern we have is the cost of higher education and the impact of student loan debt. Michelle from Warminster said, like a lot of millennials, I feel as if my life is on hold as student loan debt hangs over my head, and unfortunately all too common sentiment with our generation. What changes can Congress make to control the accumulation of excess student loan debt, and do you support student loan debt forgiveness? You'll have to excuse me, I forgot who answered the question first last time. I believe, was that you, Paul, who answered first? For the DC? Yeah. Okay, so Ashley, you'll answer first on this one.
Great. So I am a proud graduate of West Point, but also Pennsylvania public schools. And I recognize that right now, the way we fund student loans and the way we fund our public institutions is broken. And we absolutely need to address this system. And I say this as someone who supposedly did all of the right things. I went to college. I joined the Army because the Army will pay for your college. And even having done all of that, I still have $70,000 in student loan debt. So I feel the burden of this broken system as well. And at the federal level, we have a lot of tools in place where we can look to undo that burden. We can decrease interest rates. Right now, you can go to the bank and take out a home loan that has lower interest rates than you could a student loan. Something that you raise your family in and build generational wealth with, lower interest rates. That's not right. We can also look at capping monthly payments and looking at ways for students to refinance the way they repay back over time. And we can also look at the cost of our public institutions. That is fundamentally too high. Thank you. And something else we need to look at is redoing the structure of where we tell students to go. We have wonderful technical schools right here in Pennsylvania, And if we can encourage students to go back to those and pursue those passions, that's a way to not only undo the burden of student loan debt, but also continue to build good paying union jobs right here in a community that really needs them.
Thank you, Ashley. Paul, same question to you. What changes can Congress make to control the accumulation of excess student debt? And do you support student loan debt forgiveness?
Yeah, we know that education is an important, probably the most important elevator to social mobility. The problem is students get stuck in a cycle of debt when they get out, and then they can't get ahead. I'm paying off my own student loans now as I'm saving for student loans for my 3 children. So I know how difficult that is. When we look at ways to accommodate for that, we've heard a lot about the interest rate in recent discussion from the Fed. That's the federal funds rate. It's the rate that gets charged between banks. For years, we've had that as close to 0. I don't know why we can't have student debt at a rate similar to that, still accounting for the time value money so that banks make their money back. As we look forward, I think we need to reassess not only different options, 2-year colleges, vocational schools, taking student loans away from for-profit universities, but I think that degrees are a little bit different. If you're graduating with a medical degree, your possibility for employment is much higher and your possibility for income is much higher. That's different potentially from somebody who's maybe graduating with a degree in education, who's going to do a public service as a teacher and whose income might not be as high. So I think we need to be discriminate on how we look at those loans. And in terms of paying student loan debt, your second part of your question, thank you. I took on loans, it was my choice. There are a lot of people in our community who took on loans and paid it back. There are a lot of people in our community who didn't take any loans that didn't go to college maybe, and probably don't feel like they should have to pay back somebody else's student loans with their taxpayer dollars. And I don't blame them for that. I think we need to respect that. But I think restructuring the current debt that we do have is the right first step.
Thank you, Paul. I do have one follow-up for Ashley. Ashley, could you please elaborate on the second part of the question? Would you support any form of student loan debt forgiveness?
Great question. So again, looking at the system and fundamentally restructuring a lot of the instruments that the federal government can actually affect. So interest rates, looking at caps on monthly payments, and ways to refinance and pay on a schedule that actually works for the borrower. That said, I am not in support of full elimination of student loan debt because there are several generations ahead of my own who have paid their own way. And I think that is something really important to take into account. But there are very valuable tools at the federal level to make sure the burden that is currently on young families, especially that are trying to get established, but also families that are more established who have had this debt hanging over them, there are great tools to reduce that burden.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. I'm going to hand the next question back to John.
Okay, guys. So anybody who was around the Young Dems in 2020 knows that I asked this exact question to every congressional candidate. As a former school board director for the Centennial School District, I have seen firsthand how charter schools affect our public education system. Do you believe that charter schools require more oversight from the federal government? And I believe that was Paul who goes first. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, great question, Jonathan. Anything that involves our taxes and our kids should have oversight, whether it's charter schools or anything else. Charter schools started out as a great idea. It was a very innovative idea, and I'm sure there are many great charter schools out there. But the problem is that in some cases that has morphed into something very different. What's happening is we have money being siphoned off of public schools that are going now to support charter schools. And I think the largest charter school in Pennsylvania recently was found to have had $1.2 million in reimbursement for fees. Budgets are zero-sum games. If you're going to put money in one place, that means you can't put that money in someplace else because there's no backfill of it. We look in Philadelphia right now where there are charter schools. What's happening is we have some programs within public school systems that are being closed down because they can't afford it. Meanwhile, we have money going to other charter schools. And so once again, we have one part of the population that's disproportionately affected by this. So the answer is yes, charter schools are a good idea, but they need much greater oversight than they're getting right now.
Okay, Ashley, do you need the question again?
No, I'm good. Thank
Okay.
you. And as I shared earlier, I am a product of Pennsylvania public schools, and I'm incredibly proud of that because not only a high school teacher is how I got to West Point, his help and mentorship. So that is incredibly important to me. I still have close relationships to the teachers who taught me in that public school that I was in Penargil High School. In fact, I spent New Year's evening with her and her family. So those connections in our public schools are incredibly important. And yes, we need greater oversight on our charter schools because right now, some of the resources that are going to them are being taken from our public schools. And we really need to look into that and put greater regulation and oversight on charter systems.
Awesome. So I have a follow-up on this as well. So when federal ESSER funds, and ESSER funds are funds meant to help with learning loss and other issues surrounding COVID, but specifically for supplies and such things that are needed for brick and mortar schools. When ESSER funds were being allocated, cyber charter schools were able to apply and get for them to the point where I believe the single biggest school that got ESSER funding in Pennsylvania was Agora Cyber Charter. Do you think that cyber charter schools should be eligible for federal funding meant for COVID issues when they were already set up as virtual? And Ashley, you can go first.
Yes, thank you. So fundamentally looking at what benefits the students the most is where we need to start, and what gives teachers and students resources and what best positions them to be the best teaching professionals and students to best receive information is paramount. So I would need to look into this a little bit more to see what the conditions were. If it fundamentally benefited the students, that is something we need to take into account. But also if funds are being misused or being over applied in a situation where they were already set up, that is something else we need to take into account. So I would need to get a little bit more information on the situation to give you a certain answer. But my baseline will always be, where is our money going? Is it being used in a way that is not efficient? And is it benefiting the students that it's going to?
Okay, Paul?
Thanks. So we live in a different world now. I think in some ways we're all cyber schools. And so we need funding to support kids no matter where they are. I can tell you my wife is a teacher and my sister-in-law is a teacher in the Bucks County School District. And they oftentimes have to go out and buy their own supplies because they're not funded enough from the school system to do it for them. I see that and I shake my head and wonder how is it even possible that we have to go out in this day and age in a county like Bucks County and still buy our own school supplies. So whether it's a cyber school or elsewhere, I do think we need to make sure that we have the funding that kids need to do the job to learn in schools.
Okay, I will turn it back over to Dan.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. All right. Our next question will be about gun safety. Earlier this week, families of the victims of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting reached a $73 million settlement with gun manufacturer Remington over their role in selling the rifle used in that shooting. Do you support victims being able to sue gun manufacturers? And how do you plan to reduce gun violence in our country? Paul, we'll start with you.
So I think civil liability is an important part for all of us. We have civil liabilities for almost all industry to protect both citizens and consumers against, companies that are misaligned with our safety. Almost all industries have that, but the gun industry has been able to operate with almost near impunity since the 2005 law was passed. So I think the same laws that protect citizens against any kind of industry should also be applied to the gun industry. And I think the recent decision about Remington, and they were prosecuted based on their marketing, I think that was the right call. I hope it sets the standard going forward, and I support it.
Thank you, Paul. Ashley, same question. Would you like me to reread it, or are you good?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Dan. So as a veteran who defended the Constitution, I support the Second Amendment and a citizen's right to bear arms responsibly for hunting and recreation. That said, as a former attack pilot, I understand the level of responsibility and maturity that is required to handle these weapons. And so when we look at gun manufacturers who are acting irresponsibly and looking at irresponsible marketing practices and things that we saw in that $73 million settlement, we need to hold them accountable. And in fact, we came out that same day as a campaign, as a team, and said, we will fight to continue holding firms like this accountable when they act badly. And here in our community, we need to acknowledge that gun safety is turning into, or lack thereof, is turning into a public health crisis. And again, as someone who fundamentally understands the power of weapon systems, I acknowledge that we need greater securities in place here in our community, be that universal background checks, greater controls on limiting those who are domestic violence abusers and the like from possessing firearms. These are the greater protections that we need put in place here in our community. Thank you so much, Dan.
I had a feeling you might not need that 30 seconds because it sounded like you were wrapping up, but you know. All right, thank you very much. Our next section will be about LGBTQIA+ issues. I'd like to bring John back on to talk about that.
Hello again. So when I was a school board director, I was one of, I think, 5 or 6 openly LGBTQIA+ elected officials in the entirety of Bucks County, which has a population of over 600,000. My first question is for Ashley, I believe. It's, do you believe the federal government is currently protects the LGBTQIA+ community adequately, and why or why not?
Great question. And there are many people who actually don't realize that here in the Commonwealth, you can still be discriminated against in your workplace for housing based upon your sexual orientation, your gender identity, and your gender expression. That is wrong. And we need greater federal protections to be put in place, such as passing the Equality Act, so that way it covers sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And actually, this is an issue that is so close to my heart because when I was a commander in 2016, we were putting a policy in place that would let soldiers openly transition while serving on active duty. And it was wonderful. Over the course of that year, as a commander, I had to give lessons and execute talks with people on how to be more inclusive of these individuals. And over that time, I saw those who were closed-minded become more open-minded. But then one night, Trump, a callous leader, sent out a callous tweet that said, I no longer support this policy. And overnight, I saw soldiers who were embracing a community that otherwise may not have just shut down. And those who were looking to transition openly and serve their country no longer could do so. So I saw firsthand the harms that lack of protections for those who are most vulnerable can cause. So yes, we can put greater protections at the federal level, so that way, even here at the state level, we have those protections in place as they currently don't exist for people right here in the Commonwealth.
Okay, and Paul?
Thanks, Jonathan. So to answer the question is, we're not there yet. We can always do more to get to an ideal state. We're moving in the right direction, but we need to keep working at it. The 14th Amendment states that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. It doesn't distinguish between people. So all persons should have that right. I think the Equality Act is the right first step. It's in the Senate now. Hopefully it would pass, and I support it. When I came home from one of my deployments in Afghanistan, I was on Capitol Hill. And at that time, we were talking about the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And having just come from combat, many members in Congress at the time asked me what I felt about that. And what I told them was, look, nobody cares when you're downrange. When you're doing a mission, when you're on a job, when you're in combat, nobody cares about anything except for getting the job done, doing the mission, solving the objective. And I think that applies to all of us. We all should just care about who we are. And by the way, I will add that the person who led that fight in Congress was none other than Patrick Murphy from right here in PA1. That took a lot of guts. It took a lot of courage. And I think Brian Fitzpatrick should take notes because that's what courage looks like.
Okay, so my second question, and I want to thank both of you because you led me right to my second question. Brian Fitzpatrick was one of only 3 Republicans to vote for the Equality Act. He voted for it twice, last time in February of 2021. This Equality Act would give the LGBTQIA community badly needed protections from discrimination. So knowing that, what makes you the better candidate on LGBTQIA+ rights? And Paul, I start with you.
I think we need to give Brian Fitzpatrick credit here where credit is due. I think we, as a candidate, it's about fighting for the rights of all people, including LGBTQ. And so on this issue, I would say, look, we should say, look, thanks, Brian Fitzpatrick, for voting on those things. That's great. It's one vote in the right direction. Here are some other areas where you've really failed us.
Okay, Ashley?
Yeah, so we need to look at votes are incredibly important, and that's what we're talking about today because they do matter. But there is also a larger conversation around protecting communities that aren't like me or communities that are different than myself or others. And that's the dialogue is just as critical. And again, here in the Commonwealth, we don't have, or you can still be discriminated against for things like sexual orientation. And Brian Fitzpatrick remains quiet around the larger discussion. And that shows he is trying to hide behind maybe voting this way or that way, but he won't contribute to the larger discussion, which is also equally important. And like the story I shared earlier, as a commander, I was in an attack unit that was almost all male, all heterosexual male. And when we look at ways of being courageous and encouraging conversations, you have to be bold to enter into communities that may be hesitant to hear that discussion at first and have them. So we need leaders who will not only take and make the right vote, but will have the right discourse around it as well. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, well, I believe that is the last question that I will have for you. I'm going to turn this back over to the Bucks County Young Democrats Chair, Dan Wood, and thank you guys for coming today.
Thank you so much.
All right. Continuing on our discussion today, we are going to shift to healthcare. Republican officials across the country have made it clear that they will strip away every part of the Affordable Care Act that they can if given the chance. It has already been significantly undermined during the previous administration with the help of Brian Fitzpatrick. If elected, what will you do to repair the damage already done? And what can you do to strengthen healthcare protections for Americans going forward? Ashley, we'll start with you.
Yes. So as it stands, our healthcare system is fundamentally broken. And we see that with families right here in our community. The pandemic made what were already gaps in the system so much bigger. It showed the very real cracks that we have in our system. So we need leaders who will take that into account and vote accordingly. So I support the expansion of the ACA. I also support letting Medicare negotiate drug prices like the VA does. What our soldiers get, families right here should also get. Those are basic necessities that we need. Because right now, families are struggling to make ends meet. We know we have families here in our community who might be passing up on paying their rent next month because they are paying off medical bills. That is not right. That is not fair. And Brian Fitzpatrick has made it clear he is going to vote against families. Within the Build Back Better bill, he voted against capping insulin at $35 a month. Thanks, Dan. At $35 a month. Things like that, votes like that are Brian Fitzpatrick saying families do not deserve to live with dignity and prosperity. And that just is not fair. And we need to address that.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Paul, same question to you. Do you need it repeated or are you all right?
No, thanks, Dan. So this is something very near and dear to my heart. Both my wife and my son suffer from type 1 diabetes. They have for years, and we deal with this issue every single day of our lives. So how I would handle it first is to put a personal face on it. I've had to sit on the phone with insurance companies hour after hour after hour trying to get them to do something that we needed, trying to explain to them why we shouldn't have to pay for a certain medicine, or why just because the insulin ran out today and we don't need it, or our next shipment isn't due for 2 weeks, that doesn't mean the disease is going to take a break. I think we need to continue to fight for what the Affordable Care Act started. It was a good step in the right direction, but there's more to do. And I would start with prescription drug costs. Over the past 10 years, prescription drugs have increased in cost at the rate of 7 times of inflation. But if you look at some of our seniors who are living on a fixed income, that hasn't changed. Like my mother who passed away from cancer, she was paying over $10,000 in prescription drug costs. Her fixed income was $26,000. So she's paying 40% of her income on prescription drugs. And that's an issue where Brian Fitzpatrick had an opportunity to make things just a little bit better for us, and he passed. So that's real and it's personal, and I would absolutely continue that fight.
Thank you, Paul. All right, our next question, pretty straightforward. Do you support the Women's Health Protection Act and its goal of protecting access to abortion care across the United States? Paul, we'll start with you.
I 100% support it. I have two daughters the oldest is 16 and her youngest is 12. And I want to make sure that my daughters have access to healthcare and have the opportunity to make their own decisions about their own bodies with us as a family and with their healthcare provider. I see that from that lens, but I also know that I don't necessarily need to have daughters to understand that what's happening in places like Texas is wrong. And I don't need to have daughters to understand that that is disproportionately affects people of color and underserved communities when they don't have access to that reproductive health care. So yes, I would continue to support it through the Women's Healthcare Protection Act.
Thank you, Paul. Ashley, same question.
Yes, I support it. And here's another example where I have very real skin in the game. It terrifies me what the world might look like when these protections are most likely overturned this summer. It terrifies me. And Brian Fitzpatrick has time and time again made it very clear he is not going to protect a woman and a family's right to choose, their freedom to choose. And that's incredible. We really need to look at it as an economic issue as well, an incredibly important economic issue. Because as we know, families here are living paycheck to paycheck. Basic necessities are tough. We are watching billionaires launch into space while families right here are struggling to make ends meet. And here's another economic burden Brian Fitzpatrick has said he wants to put on families. Because statistically, the woman who gets an abortion is already married and has children already. So this choice as a family, Brian is taking that away. And if protections at the Commonwealth level are overturned, that means families who are already struggling may have to leave the state to get this type of health care. They will have to hire childcare for the children they probably already have, and will probably have to take off work in order to go travel to get that treatment. So that is an economic burden, it's a moral burden, and we need leaders who will stand up and protect reproductive freedoms.
Thank you both for your thoughtful responses on that. We have 2 questions left, almost done, hang in there a little bit longer. Our next question will be about the environment. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a young Democrat who doesn't believe in climate change. Younger generations are all too aware that the impacts of climate change will be something we have to deal with the rest of our lives. What do you believe is the most important step we can take to slow climate change? And if you were elected, what legislation would you propose? Ashley, we'll start with you.
Yes. So first and foremost, as someone who has served overseas, I see climate change as a national security threat. Because as precious resources are stripped away, we will see wars starting to break out in different parts of the world. I also see it as an economic threat. If Russia and China outdevelop technologies to fight climate change, we now have a competitive uphill battle, and that is important to keep in mind. But it is also an issue right here at home. Again, as someone young enough to be truly fearful of what my future will look like, what the future for my children might look like, because of climate change. This is something that I am deeply, deeply concerned about. So I think at the federal level, we can have a more robust and better funded EPA, which right here in our district, we have several Superfund sites that are contaminating our water, so we can address those. And oh, by the way, Brian Fitzpatrick voted against $50 billion that would have been in Build Back Better to treat our water right here in our communities. So the best things a leader in Congress can do is get funding to treat water and treat these contaminated sites that are here in our community and get it into the hands of local leaders who know their areas best to treat the systems that are polluting the water our families drink. And that is also in concert with making sure we fight it on a national security issue, or on a national security front as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. Paul, same question to you.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. I remember when I was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or prior to getting on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen said, you know, climate change is one of our major national security issues. And I saw that real time. Fields become, or agriculture no longer becomes arable. We have migratory patterns, people move, there's conflict, that conflict runs downhill. So there's lots of reasons why we need to focus on climate change. The question though is, you know, what are we going to do about it right now here? What are the most important steps we can take? It's about transitioning our infrastructure while we also keep people employed. I think we have to keep that in mind, but we have to start moving in that direction right now. And there's a few things that we can do right now in the short term. The first thing we need to do is upgrade our outdated infrastructure. The second thing we need to do is make sure that we digitize our grid, our outdated grid system. I think we also need to overhaul our transportation system. We need to have electric vehicles and other vehicles that can run off of renewable energies. We also need to upgrade the infrastructure system so that we have charging stations along the way. And then the third thing we need to do is we need to improve our technologies, because we focus almost entirely on the supply side of that equation. We need to start focusing on the demand side of the equation, reducing our dependency on energy through things like better technologies, better battery chemistries, and things of that nature. Those are things we can do right now.
Thank you, Paul. All right, we are on to our last question. And since it's the Young Democrats debate, it's about marijuana. Do you support, it's a pretty easy question to start with. Do you support the legalization of marijuana for recreational use? If so, do you support using the revenue from legalization to address the lasting impacts of racial inequality that have resulted from the war on drugs? Paul, we'll start with you.
The short answer is yes. We've seen that criminalization of marijuana doesn't work. If the idea is to stop the use of marijuana, we've seen that the outcome isn't there, because clearly it doesn't stop. In fact, in some cases, it makes it work worse, because it sends that to an underground system that we have to tie up police resources for. I think legalizing marijuana gives us the opportunity to create jobs. It gives us the opportunity to create revenue and income for a tax structure. Studies show that by 2025, if we were to legalize marijuana, we could gain as much as $25 billion in tax revenue. It frees up police resources to go do more important things. It frees up space in our jails. It also, by regulation, it makes the use of marijuana that much safer. So the answer is yes, Dan.
Great, thank you, Paul. Ashley, same question to you.
Yes, and I will start by saying I recognize that many of my brothers and sisters in arms are turning to the use of marijuana to treat their trauma. So this is something very important to me. And I also recognize that we are in a place right now where, at the very least, decriminalizing the use of marijuana and expunging the records of those who have charges associated with it is the bare minimum of what we can do. And then legalizing its use, I'm very open to that conversation, because as you mentioned, there are several revenue sources that other states have proven that can come in and make the Commonwealth more robust. And that's where we get into the conversation of, this is now revenue to go back and treat and undo the injustice caused by the system we had in place in the first place.
Great, thank you so much. Ashley, Paul, thank you very much for your thoughtful responses today. That ends the question segment that we have prepared. You both didn't use all the time necessary, so we have plenty of time left for closing statements. Since Paul deferred in the opening statements, Ashley, you will present the first closing statement, and Paul, you will close us out today. Ashley, the time is yours.
Thank you so much. This was an incredible conversation. I am so grateful to have been here with you all. And in my closing, I want to start by addressing an issue that I know a lot of us Democrats are concerned with, and that's the seeming loss of Democrats from the party over the last 5 years or so. And I want to start by saying that I believe I am the leader that can not only flip this seat, but who can bring Democrats back to the party. As a young woman, as a combat veteran, as someone with $70,000 in student loan debt over her head, as someone who grew up right here in southeastern Pennsylvania to a working class family, to a single mom whose family is still dealing with the effects of the opioid crisis, mental health issues, and the socioeconomic burdens that leaders like Brian Fitzpatrick put upon us, I am the best leader to flip this seat and get Brian Fitzpatrick out of this seat because I have very real skin in the game. Brian Fitzpatrick is a leader who will happily go to Washington and leave all of his constituents behind to cozy up to those who will undo our democracy and line his pockets. And that is something we need to keep in mind. He is no longer the leader for us. I will be the leader who will vote courageously in a way that our community deserves. And I'm so grateful to have discussed the issues with you all today. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley. All right, Paul, 2 minutes for your closing statements. Take us home.
Thanks very much, Dan. And thanks again to the Bucks County Young Dems. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning. As a fighter pilot, I know all too well the importance of staying oriented on the job. Upside down, right side up, sideways, you name it, I've been there. And all throughout, it's so important to stay oriented to the direction, to the objective, and to the mission. The same is true in my business that I lead today, and the same is true in politics. And the truth is, our political leaders have lost their orientation to what's most important to us. Healthcare, climate change, Social Security, equality, many of the things that we talked about today, the list goes on. Those things should be substantive policy decisions aimed at finding solution, and instead we're arguing about those things on the basis of party affiliation and evidence-free conspiracy theories. Anybody can talk about policy. Anybody can read about policy in a book or on a website or in a white paper somewhere, but nothing takes the place of real experience. We all know that things are different in real life, and having the ability to see those issues through the lens of real experience, to identify with what people are going through every single day matters. I want to go to Congress so I can fight for families like mine here in Bucks County, because I know how hard that is, and it's real. And I want to go to Congress to fight for healthcare that's affordable and accessible for all of us. And I want to go to Congress to make sure I fight for the future of our economy, small businesses, whether you're starting a small business or just trying to keep one open and you're trying to plan for the future, because I know what it's like to have to do that. The Navy taught me to never give up on a problem, to never walk by something and ignore it, whether it was mine or not, to take responsibility for it and to take accountability for it. It's how I was as a Navy commander. It's how I lead in the business I lead today. And it's how I would lead in Congress. Too many Americans have given up on government. They think we have a government that doesn't work for them. They think we have a government that doesn't care for them. And I don't blame them, because that's what we've seen. I have the ability to do that. I have the experience to do that. I think I'm the right person to beat Brian Fitzpatrick because I have that experience. And I think that people of Bucks County deserve that. And I'm ready to go to work for that. And thank you again, Dan.
Thank you, Ashley and Paul. Before we sign off, sorry, got ahead of my own notes. Have to screw up at least once. Thank you again to our candidates, Ashley and Paul, for joining us this morning. Hopefully you can both take a little bit of time today to relax before you head back out on the campaign trail. Best of luck to both of you, and we can't wait to support whichever one of you earns the right to challenge Brian Fitzpatrick in November. I would like to take this moment to plug the Young Dems again. We are always looking for new members. We are trying to rebuild our numbers to make sure we come out strong in 2022 for Ashley or Paul and the rest of our candidates up and down the ballot this year. Before we sign off today, I would like to take a moment to remind everyone of the importance of the primary election this spring. Obviously, we're all interested in supporting either Ashley or Paul in their race, as well as the contested races across the state. But there's more at stake this year. As we speak, Republicans in Harrisburg are rushing to get their agenda items on the ballot to change the state constitution so that they can manipulate the rules for voting to better suit their needs of holding on to power. However you may feel about the candidates running, there are potentially real dangers to our democracy this year if you don't show up to vote in the primary. And please, don't forget to remind your friends too, and bring as many Democrats as you can to the polls. One last time, on behalf of the Bucks County Young Democrats, thank you all for attending this morning's debate. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and look forward to seeing you at the polls on primary election day.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much.